Welcome back to Salted Hash. I'm Julia Beauchamp, and I'm here with J.M. Porup, and we are going to be discussing ICS security and how to secure critical infrastructure. This episode of Salted Hash is sponsored by Veracode. The company's latest State of Software Security report points to the power of DevSecOps as a way to mitigate application risk. Learn how this emerging practice can help your organization minimize software flaws by tuning into Veracode's new podcast series, which you can find at the address below. So, JM, there is a lot of talk about securing our critical infrastructure, energy, utilities, transportation, manufacturing, and that's in the government and private sectors. Could you expand a little bit about why this is such a hot topic of conversation right now?
Sure. So we built a world of automation in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Energy plants, nuclear facilities, transportation, using technology intended to be deployed with 30, 40, 50-year lifespans. If you're in a back office IT environment, you're replacing laptops on maybe a 3-year or maybe a 4-year refresh life cycle. You have a very quick refresh life cycle compared to industrial systems. Additionally, many industrial control systems were deployed and invented well before the invention of the internet. If you look at a protocol like Modbus, it is insecure by design because it was never anticipated to be connected farther than the factory floor. You would have a human-machine interface on the factory floor, and the machine was right there, you know? So we're in a situation now where, in an attempt to gain greater efficiencies, these insecure by design technologies are being plugged into the internet to be administered remotely, thus exposing these very sensitive, very critical elements of infrastructure to all of the threats that we see everywhere else on the internet, but with much more severe consequences. If your email server gets hacked and you lose your company's spreadsheets, you know, that's bad, but nobody's going to die. Like, you know, perspective. But if if your factory explodes, destroying your merchandise, the facility, and killing your employees, like, that is a far graver failure mode. So dealing with the rampant insecurity by design and the much more severe consequences of failure has many people in government and law enforcement and industry very concerned.
So because these are older technologies, it seems as though it is difficult to sort of retroactively secure them. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. If you're it's difficult but not impossible to replace all of your Windows XP boxes in your enterprise. Mm-hmm. It's more difficult to replace, a $500,000 machine in your factory, for instance. And the other thing is that downtime is far less acceptable in an industrial environment. If you find malware on an industrial control system, it's just as likely the management will say, we're just going to live with the malware because we can't afford to take an hour or 2 hours or 12 hours to turn the machine off to update it, because availability is so much more important than any worries about confidentiality. It has to work, it has to keep working and not stop working. And so the sort of IT security mindset that many viewers today probably bring to their jobs is completely different from the so-called OT, or operational technology perspective, required to secure industrial control systems, which have a completely different threat model and a very different failure mode.
Yeah, I mean, the failure is affecting, it's just so much wider if there's an attack on an electric grid than if there's an attack on your company's email server. That's a really good point. So, and there are examples of these sort of big attacks on ICS and infrastructure. Can you touch on a few examples and sort of what those outcomes were? Because they can be absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah, so you're talking about a very different adversary here. If we look at the history of, say, criminal hacking, the vast majority of illegal hacking is profit-driven. It's ransomware, or it's stealing credit cards, or stealing Bitcoin, or it's engaged in financially motivated criminal activity. And that encompasses the vast majority of sort of criminal hacking today. Whereas there is no real financial reward for a criminal to hack the energy grid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no money there. And if you try to like hold the energy grid ransom to a government, you know, their military is going to find your basement and they're going to bomb you out of existence or arrest you and put you in a hole. You know, so it would be a very foolish criminal with the wrong motives who would ever try to do that, which leaves nation states. The people who are actually actively today hacking industrial control systems are almost exclusively nation-state intelligence agencies seeking geopolitical leverage. So if there is ever some sort of confrontation between nation states, then one side can say, you know, I have your energy grid in the palm of my hand, do what I say or else. And it's very simplest. That is what is going on in the industrial control system space. It's about the struggle for power between nation states in the world today. And if you like, we can. I mean, the modern history of ICS hacking really begins with Stuxnet, the joint U.S.-Israeli operation under President Obama to hack the Iranian centrifuges that were being used to refine uranium as part of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Mm-hmm. And that was the first. That was the first time that we know of that nation states engaged in active sabotage in a hostile way in this manner. And that set a precedent. Almost every year since, we have seen active clandestine attacks of sabotage between nation states. We saw the destructive attack on Aramco, the Saudi Arabian oil company, widely attributed to Iran. We see the Russian attack on the Ukraine during the several attacks on the Ukrainian energy grid by the Russian government to turn off power, to disrupt the energy grid as a means of flexing their muscle. And it's expected this will continue and potentially get worse.
Absolutely. So time is really of the essence for nations to make sure that they're securing their infrastructure. So what is a way that these nations and governments can make sure that they are having secure infrastructure?
So time out here, Chris. I'm not having any video. Can you see me?
You're frozen.
My video froze. I turned it off and turned it on again, and it's not coming back on.
Huh.
Just keep going?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'll ask that question again.
Yeah, if you could tee it up for me again, thanks.
Yeah, just so it'll make it easier in editing. So these nations, time is really of the essence to make sure that there is a way to defend critical infrastructure. What are some concrete ways or concrete examples that nations have taken to defend their grids, or have there not really been that many attempts?
So I interviewed a former NSA researcher by the name of Robert Lee, who works for a company called Dragos. And he testified before Congress over the summer. And what he said in his testimony certainly made sense to me, being that unlike IT security systems, there's no amount of passive defense that is sufficient to prevent active nation-state adversaries from penetrating your critical infrastructure. If you're defending against a worm or a virus or any kind of automated attack seeking low-hanging fruit in an IT security environment, there are trivial ways to prevent that. You can patch, you can improve your firewall rules, you can unplug things. There's all sorts of ways that we know of to defend against that.
Right.
But if you have an actual human at a keyboard in Moscow or Tehran or Pyongyang that's actively entering your water treatment facility or your energy grid, then the only way to defend against that is so-called active defense, where you have a defender monitoring the network in real time, looking for signs of unwanted intrusions and evicting those people as soon as possible. And that requires people working at the keyboards, watching those facilities, and there is as yet no automated way to do that. And this is really where the cybersecurity skills shortage really starts to show how grave the problem is, because there is nowhere near enough people to sit in those SOCs, in those security operations centers, actively monitoring these industrial systems and actively evicting adversaries as they show up.
Absolutely. I mean, there's just so many places that can, or not places, but rather important infrastructure that could be susceptible to attack. I mean, yeah, maybe is there a guy, sitting making sure that the MTA in New York City isn't being hacked and shutting down all the subway signals? I don't know. Is there a person doing that, or do you think that there is one?
Well, I'm not an expert on the MTA, and let it be said. However, I do recall reading, and this is a little bit humorous. So I remember reading an article about the MTA, the subway signaling system in New York City was built in like 1896, and they are
old.
still. Yeah, it's like Wile E. Coyote, the cogs in the machine sort of thing. It looks like that. They are using like 19th century technology to run the subway, which offers poor efficiency, but is relatively immune from remote hacking by foreign adversaries. So sometimes being an early adopter in this space is not always the wisest move.
That's true. So maybe is there some guy sitting at a computer at our electrical providers, or let's use a big city example at, a New York City who supplies your electricity?
Con Ed.
Con Ed. Is there a guy working for Con Ed who is an active defender against foreign adversaries? Do you think?
I should call up Con Ed and ask them. I don't know the answer to that question, but
right.
It's a great question, and maybe that's the story to write.
And if they don't have one, do you think that they should?
It gets very complicated here because, like, before we had the internet, it was pretty clear that the military was in charge of defending borders. Like,
sure.
If an army invaded your country, it's pretty clear the military's job is to prevent them from doing so. And nobody would say that, it was the job of, a private corporation to prevent people with guns from crossing your border and attacking you. That would be a ridiculous thing to say.
That's true.
But now we find ourselves in this very, frankly, bizarre situation where the military is not able to defend private organizations, even critical infrastructure, from attacks by foreign militaries,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the Chinese military or the Russian military or the Iranian military invading electronically critical infrastructure on U.S. soil in pursuit of geopolitical leverage.
Mm-hmm.
And we're saying to underfunded public utilities, you need to defend against foreign militaries invading the country. That's that's really a weird thing to say, given what we consider historical precedent.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that the U.S. military and NSA are thinking about these questions, but it's not at all clear how you solve that problem in a scalable way without, I don't know, declaring martial law or something, because that's also not desirable. The people at these small utilities are not capable of defending our critical infrastructure from foreign militaries invading. That's prima facie ridiculous. Nobody would reasonably say that if there was an army invading from Canada or Mexico or something. So this is a really hard problem that has not been solved, because it's not a technical problem. It's also an economic and a political problem.
Absolutely. And even just mentioning, going to a utility company and saying you must defend against foreign adversaries, it sounds almost dystopian, but it really is reality.
Yeah. And it's not, and the staffing problem especially becomes a major blocking point here. We can talk about manufacturing and for-profit companies, but in many cases, critical infrastructure is publicly owned and operated, or like even if a nuclear power plant is a public-private partnership, it's basically de facto public infrastructure that exists for the public good. And so these things exist not for profit but for the good of society. And how do you defend that critical infrastructure? Technically, we know we need very smart, well-trained cybersecurity professionals engaged in active defense of these facilities.
Yeah.
But we don't have the people. We don't even have close to the people we need.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't really solved the political problem of how we deal with asking these kinds of entities to defend against foreign intrusions.
Sure. So the most likely threats against critical infrastructure are coming from foreign adversaries. Have there been really any examples in the U.S. of a Russian government, Chinese, North Korean, Iranian government attacking these critical infrastructures? Or does it just kind of seem like a rest of the world problem that the U.S. started?
So it's important to separate the facts from the hysteria.
Sure.
There was, for instance, 2 or 3 years ago, an hysterical article about Iran hacking a dam in New York.
Right.
But I remember looking into it, and it was a dam not connected to the internet. Like, the control gates were not connected to the internet. It was just like the video camera that watched the dam was. So Iran hacked the video camera that watched the dam, basically. But the dam itself, and it was like a tiny little dam that was like 10 feet high or something that would have flooded a neighborhood maybe. Like, it wasn't even a big deal. And people, the media really blew it out of proportion, like Iranian hackers are going to flood New York City by hacking a dam. It was just like, this is a serious problem, but it's also important to keep a calm head and not blow things out of proportion either. Because, when we're talking about this kind of geopolitical leverage, it's very rare, at least so far, to see actual destructive attacks. There was not Petya, it must be true. It must be said, which is true. And we saw, if it was in fact North Korea that hacked Sony, I'm not entirely sure that's the case, but
sure.
that was also a fairly deranged thing to do. So if North Korea is in fact off the leash, they could in theory do something crazy like that. But by and large, when you're looking for geopolitical leverage, it's about the threat, not the action. It's like we managed to survive a Cold War with nobody firing any nuclear missiles because that would have defeated the purpose.
True.
The point of nuclear weapons is the threat, not to actually use them, because once you've actually used them, you've kind of lost the war.
Yeah.
And while nation-state hacking of ICS is by no means the same thing as nuclear war, it is different in so many important ways, it remains about geopolitical leverage, not about actually blowing things up, because that could potentially escalate very quickly.
Oh, absolutely. I don't even really want to imagine how that could escalate. So securing critical infrastructure does sort of require a different thought process with security, because it is operational technology. It's not securing your email servers. It's not, But how are security professionals thinking about this, and what steps is really the active defender concept the only step that has been taken to secure critical infrastructure?
Now, there are startups that are looking at innovating new ways to secure operational technology, because the problem is really defense at scale and automating that defense. And there, I've seen companies working on the problem. There are many very smart people trying to solve the problem. It does not yet appear to me to be solved. And one of the really key points that I think that is worth taking away from this conversation for our viewers is that of all the countries in the world, the United States is perhaps the most vulnerable, because we were the early adopters and the inventors of this technology. And that means that we actually have the most to lose. If there were a tit-for-tat sort of sabotage war on critical infrastructure, the United States would be the big loser of that kind of conflict. And that so far has led to the U.S. to be relatively timid in their response to these kinds of intrusions, because we just have so much more to lose. We're so much more connected society, and our government, our economy, our politics, everything is based on an interconnected network that is incredibly fragile. And in a shooting war, we would be the big loser.
Got it. So conversely, is there a push? This is pure speculation, but is there a push to automate ICS hacks? Or is that still going to be something that's very human-operated, person from a nation-state sitting and trying to break into an electrical grid?
Sure. No, that's a great question. Unlike the internet as we know it and the software stack that we're accustomed to using and operating in, industrial control systems use completely different protocols and technologies. And there's a dizzying array of them, 40 or 50 different kinds. And to become an expert in any of these particular obscure and arcane protocols, and then learn enough about them to hack them, requires a significant amount of work. And again, there is no profit in doing so, because this is all, there's no criminal, financially motivated activity here, right?
Yeah.
So we do see evidence that nations, including Russia and Iran, and certainly the U.S., I mean, let's be clear, the United States hacks the critical infrastructure of other nations as well. I mean,
sure.
This goes both ways. And so we see evidence of frameworks being built and deployed by nation states to make it easier for them to engage in these kinds of intrusions. But so far we haven't really seen any sort of automated worm-like or virus-like attacks on industrial control systems. And I think the reason for that is at least so far, the people who engage in these kinds of attacks should at least be marginally aware of the consequences of that kind of destructive activity. And we saw this with Stuxnet. Stuxnet was originally designed specifically and even carefully designed to only attack centrifuges in Iran. But that malware escaped and began attacking, I believe these were Siemens brands centrifuges, and began attacking equipment outside of Iran. And this is how Stuxnet was eventually discovered and revealed. So there is precedent for automated industrial control system hacking that gets out of control and causes collateral damage. And let's hope we don't see that again. I don't know. It could happen.
Right. I mean, I guess sort of anything is possible in the world of hacking. And I mean, if there's a reason to, even though, you're not seeing your hobbyist hackers doing this because there isn't some sort of financial gain, it's interesting. It's really, let's hope it doesn't evolve too much. So what are some important things so our critical infrastructure is, even though some of it is based on older technology, and, like I said, or like you said, rather, the New York subway is running on 19th century, maybe early 20th century technology, what, as some forms of infrastructure evolve, maybe, for example, nuclear power, what are some important things that security professionals and security officials working at these companies can do to shore up these critical infrastructure and ICS defenses?
That is a big question.
It is.
And I'm not the person to be giving guidance to nuclear plant facilities managers on this particular topic.
It's fair.
The consequences are grave, and I would assume that someone running a nuclear facility has a direct line to people in the government who are working to secure those facilities, because nobody wants to see sort of 3 Mile Island again.
No.
You know what I mean? So yeah, I think it doesn't hurt to see greater awareness that this is a problem, and even to attract more security talent into the sort of legacy operational technology space. Because while you may not be using cutting-edge technology, you are defending critical infrastructure with severe failure modes that require top talent working to secure it.
Absolutely. And I think thinking in terms of securing infrastructure is maybe not something that our viewers necessarily think about every day. It's just, you turn on a light switch and on goes your power, but there are vulnerabilities, and it's really interesting to understand how these can be hacked. So it's really been very eye-opening. How do you see these sort of attacks evolving? Is it towards automation?
No. I mean, anything could happen.
Of course.
I think it would be unwise for any nation state to create such automated malware, but we have seen crazier things, and it only takes one for it to be incredibly destructive. If you had a NotPetya-like worm that affected industrial control systems and deliberately destroyed things just because, that could cause billions of dollars in damage. And it's not at all clear how you would prevent that.
And do you think that this could, hopefully not, but do you think that this is something that could become globally catastrophic, or is it maybe already? I don't know. I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, you can't eliminate risk. You can only mitigate it. And I think there is great awareness. For instance, in the U.S. government in Washington, there's great awareness. This is a very serious issue, and I know that both in industry and government, a vast amount of resources are being thrown at just this problem, because the United States is extremely vulnerable to this kind of attack, and probably will remain vulnerable for the near to medium term future, and that concerns many people in Washington, and with good reason. And we will see what they come up with in terms of a solution.
Yeah, there really is a push in Washington to make sure that this critical infrastructure is secured, because no one can disagree that, yeah, we should secure nuclear power plants and electrical grids and transport.
Yeah, there is wide bipartisan agreement. This is not a political football. Like everybody in Washington is like, yeah, we got a problem, let's solve it. So it's nice to see that even in the rather crazy partisan politics we see playing out today in Washington, there are some issues on which there is no real partisan rancor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it'll be definitely interesting to see how securing ICS systems evolve, and I'm excited to see it. It'll be something to absolutely pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, I have my eye on this space because it is a rapidly developing and of key importance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, JM.
No, my pleasure. Thanks, Juliet.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Salted Hash featuring JM Porup, and see you next time.